when I started thinking about putting this together, I've never had to kill 2 hours. So please ask questions as we go along, and we'll see. I'm going to try to share with you the highlights of the work that we've been doing on this topic. For the last 10 years or so, I've been looking at spirituality and religiousness in alcoholics and the extent to which it's related to recovery, which is, you could also think about, or what I've been doing since I left UB. I got a postdoc at the University of Michigan in addiction research from 98 to 01, which led to this line of research. As part of that postdoc, and you'll see how this relates, I was able to do some clinical work, about quarter-time clinical work, which was very useful. And then in 1999, NIAAA, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, sponsored a conference on studying spirituality and alcohol, which I talked my way into, and learned a tremendous amount, and decided to do some pilot work with our treatment staff, and then also a cross-sectional survey of people in recovery, both people at the treatment agency as well as any alumni or anybody I could get to fill out these questionnaires. And then subsequent to that, I got some NIAAA and foundation funding for grants to study these changes in spirituality and religion and whether or not it relates to drinking outcomes. We all think it does, or many people think it does, but do we have any evidence of this? So this is sort of the overview of the talk. We'll see if we get through it all. If we don't, that's okay too. But we're going to talk about why this might matter. What is there any empirical evidence prior to this work? The methodology of the two surveys, our findings on drinking outcomes just generally, our findings on the role of spiritual and religious events in the sense of life-changing spiritual religious experiences, loss of faith. Those are the two types of experiences I'll be talking about. And then the findings on change on different dimensions of spirituality and religiousness and their relationship to drinking outcomes. And finally, there's this cute little thing we did on looking at people's perceptions of AA's helpfulness, which we pulled from qualitative answers about midway through, and then related those answers to drinking outcomes as well as, well, what did they say about AA's helpfulness or not lack thereof. So I'll share that with you. And then throughout, there's a kind of a subtext of the fancy analyses that we're going to be doing next. Okay, so why might this be important? Well, whatever your personal inclinations, the fact is that most people in this country believe in God. Almost 90% agree that believe God watches over them, so have this sort of personal concept of God. Only 14% have no religious preference. So most of the country has some sense of religiosity and some desire to connect with God or with religious institutions. This data is from the General Social Survey of 1998. You can look at other more recent surveys. You'll find fairly similar numbers. If you ignore Parade magazine last week, which was a ghastly report of something they did, totally confusing. But Gallup has done similar surveys, so you find this is an issue for people in the U.S. The other thing is that AA, of course, a very effective intervention, encourages connection with a higher power and the use of prayer and meditation. So within this context, we find recovering alcoholics are urged to work on such issues that have classically been part of what gets tackled in religious and spiritual programs: forgiveness, service, gratitude, connection, so forth. And of course, as I found out in my pilot work, most individuals in recovery and many treatment professionals consider change in one's spirituality and religiousness to be important, if not crucial, to the process of recovery. It's always interesting to bring this one up, but Carl Jung thought that there was a connection, and he coined this phrase, spiritus contra spiritum, which is Latin for spirits against spirit. And it was in a letter to Bill Wilson in 1961, in which he remarked that it might not be an accident that we refer to alcoholic drinks as spirits, And perhaps alcoholics have a greater thirst for spirit than other people, but it's been misdirected into a bottle, those kind of spirits, instead of to the more fundamental type of spirit. So it's sort of interesting that for some time people have been thinking this way about this connection between letting go of this very destructive habit, if you want to just think of it as a habit, and building better strategies for managing the day-to-day difficulties of life. So, is there empirical evidence? Well, we know that there are lower levels of alcohol and drug use amongst people with religious affiliation and participation, which doesn't really relate to most alcoholics because they tend to be kind of low on religious affiliation and participation. As a matter of fact, there's some people who think that they're actually alienated from religion and spirituality. We'll show you some evidence that kind of gives a nuance to that. There is significant evidence that AA, which is definitely a spiritual program, works. A number of people have written on this: Cascudas, Tonigan, Connors, and others. Cascudas' piece, I think, is the most recent one. And then, of course, there's qualitative and anecdotal evidence that spiritual religious change has been important in people's recovery. The story of Bill W., stories from the recovery community. Just browse through Grapevine, the AA magazine, or check out Quantum Change, Bill Miller's book, in which he talks about not just about change that triggers sobriety, but just other types of spiritual change that precipitate other experiences. And it's just a sense of a shift in people's perspectives and this kind of stuff. But a number of the stories in Quantum Change are about people who developed a different relationship to substances as a consequence of these experiences. And there's been some evidence, Zemmour and Cascudas have published on this, that life-changing spiritual religious experiences, was what we investigated, but they looked at spiritual awakenings, which is the AA phrase, play a role in recovery. That people who'd had such experiences were more likely to be able to be sober. And there's quite a bit of quantitative evidence of change in people's existential sense of meaning or purpose in alcoholics. Has been found amongst alcoholics from pre-treatment to post-treatment. And there hasn't been much like follow-up. Does this persist over time? Do people's sense of purpose and meaning in life go up to normal, quote, normal levels, whatever that is? So this is the model that we're going to be kind of dancing around today. This whole idea that drinking outcomes, we know that AA involvement has an impact on drinking outcomes. And I can tell you, although I'm not going to show you a lot of evidence for this today, but there's quite a bit of evidence in our study that the more people are involved in AA, the more their spirituality and religiousness increases. But independent of AA involvement, does spiritual and religious change impact on drinking outcomes? So if you went and got your spirituality somewhere else, say at your church or at some place where you learn meditation or something like that, would that further your drinking, your reductions in drinking and support that? You can't go messing around with a difficult topic like spirituality without tackling what is it. And this is the what is it that I came up with based on my readings in the psychology of religion literature. That spirituality is in individuals' feelings, thoughts, experiences, and behaviors. So we're spanning, we're not just talking about beliefs, we're not just talking about behaviors, but the whole gadilla that arise from a search for the sacred. And I'm defining sacred here as pretty broadly, not just in terms of God or a divine being, but also in terms of ultimate reality, transcendent truth, or existential meaning. So I'm deliberately casting a fairly wide net as much as I can. And also a search for a connection to those phenomena. The reason for connection being in there will become clear a little bit later on. Religion I define much more in terms of the social context, the institution, the rituals, the prescribed behaviors that are usually tied to a particular cultural context. So I'm really defining religion fairly narrowly, and I've gotten into arguments with people who define religion much more broadly. But I think this reflects to a certain extent the way we tend to use these words in the culture at large. But I like this cartoon by Calvin and about the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, because this really illustrates the existential expansion or piece of spirituality. Let's say life is this square of the sidewalk. We're born at this crack and we die at that crack. Now we find ourselves somewhere inside the square, and in the process of walking out of it, suddenly we realize our time in here is fleeting. Is our quick experience here pointless? Does anything we say or do in here really matter? Have we done anything important? Have we been happy? Have we made the most of these precious few footsteps? And hours later, they're still contemplating those questions. So this was my first little pilot study. I did a qualitative and quantitative survey of 22 treatment staff on their definitions of spirituality and religion, whether or not they thought it was important in recovery, and also then tapped and asked them to fill out a formal questionnaire to find out what their own spirituality and religiousness was like. All or almost all the staff defined spirituality as connection. There's that word. It just kept coming up. Connection to what? Connection to other people, connection to the universe, connection to themselves. So they were really using that term very broadly, connection. But also defined spirituality to include meaning and purpose, belief in a higher being, which one might predict that you might include such a thing in a definition, and ethical guidance. Doing the next right thing was what someone said. They also distinguished very sharply between spirituality and religion. And again, this is something I've had arguments with some people about. And you find the same thing when you talk to people with substance abuse problems. They really see them as very, very different. So we really need, when we research this stuff, to separate them, as well as, of course, in a clinical setting. They also believed that spiritual change was crucial to the recovery process, and felt that prayer and meditation were more essential to recovery than involvement in a religious organization. They did not advocate a particular spiritual religious path for people in recovery. Although you could say that AA, they did advocate AA, so it depends on how you want to define AA. But compared to the General Social Survey national sample, they were more spiritual but less religious. Over 3/4 of them, versus almost 40% of the national sample, had a life-changing spiritual religious experience. So this sample as a whole has obviously a pretty active spiritual life. It makes me kind of wonder if that's essential to working in this field as a clinician. The second pilot study was just a cross-sectional survey of current and former clients of this particular treatment agency. And I managed to catch 47 people. And I was interested in finding out whether or not their spirituality and religiousness was indeed more negative, restrictive, punitive, which is the words that Fowler has thrown around about this on the basis of a qualitative piece that he did. Are they more that way than the general population, and does that negativity vary as a function of length of recovery? I gave everybody the brief Fetzer National Institute on Aging Multidimensional Measure of Religiousness and Spirituality, which was published in 1999 by the Fetzer Institute. They brought together all these researchers in the spirituality religion field and put together this measure, and there's a brief version of it in the last chapter of the monograph, about 40 items, which is what I asked everybody to fill out. And the advantage of it is that it's been given to a national sample, so you can compare how your folks do compared to a national sample. What we found was that current clients, people who had less than 6 months sober, gave consistently lower endorsement to a wide range of spiritual religious items compared to those who were further along in recovery, and compared to the treatment staff, and compared to the general population. This was particularly clear for self-ratings of how religious or spiritual one is, for religious coping, and for beliefs. So as an example of that, these are self-ratings of one's religiousness and spirituality. And the question is, to what extent do you consider yourself a religious person or a spiritual person? And you had to rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 4, from 1 not at all to 4 very. And you can see how the staff, jumping way over to the right here, the staff rate themselves as 2.1 as religious people. Those who had been sober less than 6 months, about 2.1 or so. Clients more than 6 months sober, quite a bit more. The national sample, 2.6. So there's definitely differences there. But the difference between the clients on that question is not statistically significant. But the next one are to what extent do you consider yourself a spiritual person? That difference is statistically significant, even with such a small sample. And you can see the staff is even more like off the charts in terms of how important and how much this is a part of their identity. Whereas in a national sample, it's much lower. It's almost like clients who have less than 6 months sobriety. So it's almost, if you could speculate from this that perhaps people who successfully become sober do so in part by becoming much more, by cultivating that spiritual side of themselves. So from these 2 pilot projects, I developed two NIAAA projects that looked specifically at religious and spiritual change and its relationship to drinking outcomes. And both of them are longitudinal, quantitative, and qualitative studies. The Fetzer study, we followed 157 people with alcohol abuse and dependence, recruited from 1 treatment agency. They were interviewed twice at baseline and then 6 months later. The Life Transition study, which is the study we just now finished collecting data from sometime in the spring. This is fall, isn't it? 364 people, with all of them had alcohol dependence. We didn't include anybody with alcohol abuse. Recruited from 4 sites, and we interviewed them every 6 months for 2.5 to 3 years. So following them for a much longer period of time, with a final N of 285. Looking at spiritual religious change, AA involvement, drinking, and just about any other variable we could think of. This is kind of a schematic of the design of the Life Transition study, because I wanted to highlight the fact that every 3 months in between these 6-month interviews, we would collect data on drinking outcomes. That's what the TLFB is, the timeline Followback, and Form 90, which asks a bunch of questions about being in treatment and AA involvement and any kind of health care you've gotten, and so forth. The 6-month in-person interviews, besides the spiritual religious measures, included the brief symptom inventory, which is a measure of psychological states and feelings, the life events questionnaire, AA involvement, and oodles of qualitative questions. Again, please feel free to wave a hand and ask a question if you have any. I feel so odd being so way up here. So the sample were recruited from 4 sites, as I mentioned, a university hospital-affiliated outpatient treatment program, which was the source of the first study's respondents. And the second site is the Ann Arbor VA, Outpatient Substance Abuse Treatment Clinic. We got 80 people from there. The bulk of the folks came from that first site, 157. And then we recruited 34 people. We wanted to recruit more, but from a moderation-based program, which basically uses CBT techniques to help people change their drinking habits. And then we recruited a bunch of untreated people from the community through advertisements. They were not in treatment at baseline, and we got 93 people that way. Everybody had verified diagnoses of alcohol dependence, had used alcohol in the last 90 days, were over 18, not suicidal, homicidal, or psychotic, literate in English. And if they were in treatment, we waited until they were kind of just a little bit stable in treatment, in the sense of having gone through detox and engagement before we approached them about study participation. But we also wanted to catch them early in the treatment episode. these are the major spiritual religious dimensions that we measured. Perceptions of God. I have this theory, which it's going to be hard to find evidence for this, but that people's perceptions of God change as they go through this process. But the loving, controlling God scale isn't the way to do that. Anyway, we have data on that. We also have used a single item from the religious background and behavior scale of Connors, Tonigan, and Miller. This is the item on I believe in God and I'm religious. I believe in God, but I'm a spiritual person. I forget exactly that. But it's basically a gauge of the extent to which people are atheist, agnostic, or believe in God. There's also a spiritual practices scale from the Fetzer NIA measure that I mentioned earlier. We also measured current day-to-day, daily spiritual religious experiences, sort of a sense of comfort, support from spirituality, having a sense of peace, connection to other people, things like that. Values and beliefs, also from the Fetzer. And then this time around we used much better forgiveness measures. The 3 items from Fetzer are good, but there's 3 items. One is, I feel forgiven by God. The other is, I have forgiven myself. And the third is, I have forgiven others. Well, that's sort of the 3 dimensions of forgiveness, right? And just having one item doesn't give you a very psychometrically robust information. So we added Mager's behavioral assessment system, as he calls it, which gives us forgiveness of self and forgiveness of others. Everybody thinks that God forgives them, even alcoholics, so we didn't repeat that one. Religious coping strategies, we use Pargamen's RCOPES, which gives you a score for positive religious coping, the extent to which people reframe things, situations that they're dealing with in terms of religious interpretations. Negative religious coping is much more feeling abandoned by God, feeling punished by God, and things like that. Very few people, even amongst alcoholics, subscribe to negative religious coping, but it doesn't look like it's a good thing. And then purpose in life, which is the measure of existential meaning and purpose that's been around the longest and used the most and has been used by previous studies. We managed to keep 285 people in the study all the way to the end. We had to stop at 2.5 years for some of them because of budget cuts. So we won't have to get too dramatic here, but it would have been nice to have had 3 years on everybody. We had 64 people drop out and 15 deaths, which is kind of a lot of deaths for only 360 people who are in their mid-40s. But if you exclude those who died, our follow-up rate is about 82%. And then we did a nutrition analysis of those who stayed in the study all the way through versus those who dropped out, and found that those who had remained in the study had higher levels of education, fewer drinks per drinking day, and less experience with AA. There were some marginal trends. The dropouts had more severe dependence, more previous treatment, higher SIP scores. The SIP is a measure of the consequences of alcohol use. And they were more likely to have attended an AA meeting. But those are marginal trends, and I really expected that we were going to find much more dramatic things with, all our homeless people dropping out and all of our heavy drinkers dropping out, but it wasn't that bad. So that was good. Okay. So let's look at the demographics at baseline of the life transition study. I'm going to emphasize them because we follow them the longest and we have the most information on them. But this is what they look like at baseline in terms of basic demographics. 2/3 male, mid-40s, about 2 years post-high school education. A little more than a quarter had never married. About a little more than a third were married or cohabitating with someone. And about a third were separated, divorced, or widowed. And in terms of ethnicity, this breakdown kind of reflects the county, of the Washtenaw County. 82% white, 10% black, and other, including people who describe themselves as multiracial. 44% unemployed, which is pretty good, I think, for a sample of alcoholics. And the income spread was pretty wide, all the way from less than $15,000 a year to over $85,000 a year. So the really interesting thing about this particular thing is that when you look at these same demographic variables by site, they are all statistically significantly different from each other, the different sites. Notice how, of course, all the people at the VA are male, all but one. And even the ages are, the community sample group is a little bit younger, as is the university treatment program folks. The VA guys tend to be less educated. The moderated drinking program people tend to be more educated. The moderated drinking program people, 3/4 of them are married, as compared to those in any of the other sites. Ethnicity, the VA is 75% white, whereas in the community sample it's 63%, and then in the other two it's more in the 90s. So you can see there's some really interesting differences between these two sites, these 4 sites. Employment, most of the VA guys were not employed. The VA guys really have a lot of strikes against them coming into this. And again, you can see that with income as well. These are clinical characteristics at baseline. About a little more than half had had prior alcohol treatment. It had been about 26 when they first had the alcohol problems. 87% of them had had a family history. A SIP score of about 21. This is this measure of consequences of alcohol use. That's about the same as you get in some other large samples of alcoholics in terms of the number of consequences that people have had to deal with. We asked everybody every time we saw them, did they want to be abstinent? Because you couldn't necessarily assume that with this sample, and it would be useful to know if that had any impact on drinking outcomes. And about 3/4 of them said that they did indeed want to be abstinent. And when we asked, have you ever attended AA before this particular treatment episode for those who were in treatment, and about 68% of them had. Well, when you throw in the site things, once again, all the sites are statistically significantly different on all these clinical variables. 83% of the VA guys have been in treatment before, only 12% of those in the moderated drinking program. And remember, everybody meets criteria for alcohol dependence, even those in the moderated drinking program. The moderated drinking program people also were somewhat older when they started to develop alcohol problems, as compared to the VA guys and the community sample guys who tend to develop it in their early 20s. Everybody has family history. The VA guys probably are the highest on that. SIP scores also vary with the moderated drinking program, either not admitting or not having that many consequences. And as you would predict, the people in the community sample who are not in treatment and the moderated drinking program people don't really want to be abstinent, particularly not compared to the other two treatment sites. And the moderated drinking program people had not been to AA either before. So then we collected outcome data. I referred to the timeline Followback, which is basically like a calendar. You sit down with the person and basically reconstruct their drinking over the last 60 days or 90 days, whatever your time period is that you're interested in. And then from that, you can abstract a couple different measures. In our case, we abstracted percent days abstinent in the last 90 days, percent heavy drinking days, where heavy drinking is defined as 5 or more for men, 4 or more for women. Mean drinks per drinking day, and days since last drink. The idea is, people's drinking patterns vary tremendously. One person is a binger, another person is, it's a 6-pack every night, or 2 bottles of wine every night. So you want to not just pick up on days abstinent, but also just how much drinking and how often were they drinking. We also picked up on a number of days people used marijuana, cocaine, and other drugs, but we have barely started to touch that data, so I won't be talking about it today. And the short inventory of problems, as I mentioned, the SIP, which is a measure of the consequences of alcohol use. So this is the drinking data in the last 90 days at baseline from the timeline Followback data. You can see that for everybody, about 56%, a little bit more than half of the last 90 days, people were sober. 33% had had a heavy drinking day during the last 90 days. When they drank on average 10 drinks, and on average, they had 25 days sober. Well, once again, when you look at it by site, there's some tremendous differences. With the VA guys having the most percent days abstinent, the community sample guys having the largest percent heavy drinking days. The VA guys, when they did drink, had the most drinks per drinking day, and the moderated drinking people had the lowest. And days since last drink also varies, with the two groups that are continuing to drink and have no interest in not drinking, having had a drink much more recently than those in the two treatment samples. Sure, definitely.
The days since last drink.
Right.
Why do you think that it's such a long period of time for the VA group?
There were some, we tried to, as I mentioned, we tried to catch people at the beginning of a treatment episode when they had been there we tried to catch them within a month of a treatment start date. It was very hard to catch up with the VA guys. They were inconsistent in their attendance, and so it required going back again and again to that same group that met every Wednesday at 2 o'clock that this person was supposed to show up for in order to catch them.
I was wondering if it was perhaps related to hospitalization?
I couldn't say at this point whether or not the VA guys, their pattern of treatment use was much more cycling in and out of treatment than the university treatment program people. There was a lot of that people sort of hung around the place, and then they'd disappear and go off on a bender or something, and then they'd come back eventually, hopefully. And so was it a new treatment episode when they returned? And so we sort of had this rule of thumb that they had to have been disappeared for at least 6 weeks for us to consider it a new treatment episode. The VA just keeps them in the system, and they don't count it as a new treatment episode. So there were some tricky things here in terms of figuring out exactly how to count things and who was eligible to recruit and that kind of thing. Sure. Well, that's don't call them a control sample. They are not in treatment. But that's the community sample. They're untreated. But a control sample implies that that there's been some either random assignment or some effort to match, and that's not at all true here. I mean, the community sample tended to be either the homeless folks. We became known in the homeless community. You could go and participate in this study, even though you're not in treatment. They still want to talk to you. They'll give you money, that kind of stuff. But we also got a fair number of worried well people, or people who just barely met criteria, who were a little concerned that maybe they have a problem, and they wanted us basically to confirm for them.
So the community people, all of them also met alcohol?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, yeah, right. Everybody, all 364 people, do meet the criteria, DSM-4 criteria for alcohol dependence.
It's so interesting that you're looking at that bottom line, the days since the last drink. If they're the ones not getting treatment.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the community sample people tend to be also the more severe, much more severely in terms of number of symptoms and severity and that kind of stuff compared to the moderated drinking program people or the other samples. They definitely need treatment. So I thought it would be useful now to look at, well, does drinking change over time? Is there anything here to get excited about? And even when you look at just everybody, whether they were in treatment or not, whether they were involved in AA or not, whether their spirituality and religiousness increased or not, everybody's drinking decreased. And I don't know if that's a study effect. If you meet with someone every 6 months just to talk, does that have an impact on your drinking? Does that raise your awareness of how much you're drinking? And it probably does. We can't prove it. We can't really investigate it because we don't have a group of people who we didn't follow. But this I wanted to show you this slide just so that you get a sense of how drinking does decrease over time. This is percent heavy drinking days over time, going all the way out to 27 months. But if you do a survival analysis, which Mike Finn did as part of his undergraduate honors thesis, time to first heavy drinking episode, you can see that, well, by the time you get out to about a little over 2 years, only about 20-25% have not relapsed at least once to heavy drinking. Of course, one episode of heavy drinking is not necessarily meaning that this person has gone back to full-blown drinking, right? Which is well illustrated, here, in this slide. This is a heat map, as Amy Krentzman, my new postdoc, describes it. The top pattern are examples of 6 people. The black is, the dark is heavy drinking, the gray is moderate drinking, and the pale blue are people who are not drinking at all, okay? So we got 4 different patterns here. With the people on the top, they're pretty much heavy drinking all the time. Maybe sometimes they go all the way down to moderate drinking, but there's heavy drinking going on. Every 3 months when we talk to them, heavy drinking was reported. Pattern 2 is much more sort of an on-again, off-again thing. There's a bunch of zeros in there for these folks, but you can see how they're really struggling to stay sober, and they have episodes of being clean and sober for a year, maybe more, and then pick it up again. Pattern 3, these are the moderate drinkers, where these people are just they're drinking under what we call heavy drinking, but they never. Only a few of them really stopped. Pattern number 4, these are the people who we might be willing to consider are in recovery in the sense of they've been clean and sober for at least a year at the end of the study. So let me just go back here. I was in the middle of this survival analysis. This is kind of fun. Well, the VA guys really like this. The VA clinicians really appreciate this. Abstinence Program 1 is the University Treatment Program. Abstinence Program 2 is the VA. They're not significantly different in this chart. Can you tell which is which, or should I come over and wave? I can do that. These 2 top ones up here, these are the 2 treatment sites. And this is the moderated, the solid bar here, down here is the moderation program, and the dotted line is the no treatment group. So you can see that the people who were in treatment, no matter what else was going on, they relapsed at a slower rate to heavy drinking. The VA people were much cheered by this. I think it's very easy when we're in the trenches with folks, and the people who are doing well, we never see them again, right? But the people who relapse, there they are again, on your doorstep. And we can get really discouraged and think that that's typical. And it's easy to forget about the person who we never see. Yeah?
Can you clarify what exactly you're doing here?
Sure.
Surviving. Can you clarify what exactly that measures?
Percent surviving in the sense of the percent who have not relapse to heavy drinking. So you can see how the percent, it looks like everybody kind of loses it, which is most obvious here in this slide in which we look at everybody. This is everybody at all the sites. So we're charting time, at what point people relapse in time. And everybody who's below this line has not relapsed. Everybody above this line has relapsed to heavy drinking.
So it's looking at, 100 and 200 days is when most people drop off into the relapse.
You could look at it that way. It depends on what you want to know. Do you want to know, at what point does half your sample relapse to heavy drinking? So at that, you would go 50% of your sample would be about right here, right? So we go across this way. So a little under 200 days. Half of them, if you look at everybody, have relapsed to heavy drinking. Now, yeah, whether they're in treatment or not, whether they were in moderated drinking programs or in a treatment program. So that's one of the reasons why this analysis by site is useful, because then you can see that for the people who were in treatment, it takes longer for them to get to that point, where 50% of them have relapsed to heavy drinking. Thank you for asking me to clarify that. And do feel free to ask questions if I get too obscure. I'm buried in the world of research.
Just a question about your VA sample.
Yeah.
A lot of veterans have a disability determination that's been made by the VA that they'd be in danger of losing if they were too recovered. To what degree did you at least do your data collection to really address that they didn't have to worry about that as an outcome of being honest about their drinking?
We didn't specifically address it. We told them that whatever they told us, we would not tell their clinicians. So they knew that what they were telling us was confidential. And that was true of the people on the other treatment site as well. That, once they were recruited into the study, we didn't share with the clinical staff what we found. We couldn't without their permission. Okay. So other predictors of time to first heavy drinking episode besides treatment site turns out to be marital status, which surprised me. People who'd never been married relapse sooner than those who were married cohabitating, or people who were separated, divorced, or widowed. So the separated, divorced, and widowed and the married people were very similar on these kind of charts. But people who'd never been married, they relapse much sooner. And it's not clear if that's because they don't have the social support, or is that because they don't have social skills to begin with, and so it's hard for them to utilize a recovery strategy that's built around connecting with other people, like AA. The other variables are age. Older respondents do better. Age of onset, people who, as you might predict, people with early age of onset relapse sooner. They have much more severe dependence. And AA exposure. People who had prior AA experience were slower to relapse. Okay, we talked about this. Any questions about this? We think this is the coolest thing in our group. And we're taking off from this in a bunch of other ways. Did I? Okay. So now let's talk about spirituality and religiousness. 74% believe in God, which is a little low. And the remainder either don't believe or they're not sure. They're sort of in the middle. But one way in which they're really different from a national sample is whether or not they have a current religious preference. 35% do not have a current religious preference, whereas in a national sample, 14% don't have a current religious preference. So these people are definitely, I would say, from this and other things, alienated from standard religious institutions. However, 70% of them were brought up in a religious tradition. Only 23% of them still practice that religion, and only 25% are involved in a congregation at all. So formal religious involvement is not a hook. It's not going to get people. One of the threads that we followed is a question that we asked at each time point: have you ever had a life-changing spiritual religious experience, a gain in faith or a loss in faith? Actually, after the first time, the way we asked it was, since the last time we talked to you, have you had such an experience? And what we found was that at baseline, 47% said that they had had a life-changing spiritual or religious experience. Whereas when you ask the same question of a national sample, the General Social Survey, 39% have had such an experience. So alcoholics are having more of these kinds of experiences, which is kind of intriguing, isn't it? Maybe Jung was right. 42% reported having experienced a loss of faith, which seems, it's kind of hard to judge whether that's a lot or a little because we don't have any national data on that. But we should try to find such information. Yeah, there were two. There were four separate questions. Right.
Could be losing faith. Could be life changing.
Oh yes, right,
So I
right,
just wanted to understand whether.
right. Yeah. As you'll see when I'll show you some of the qualitative findings, and you'll see that for some people it was that way, but for most people interpreted life-changing spiritual religious experience positively. And very often then when you then followed it with a question about a gain in faith, they said, well, this experience I just told you about. And then we would ask them, have you ever had a loss of faith? So there were actually three separate questions. And if they'd had the experience, we would ask when it occurred and tell us about it. And we wrote it all down. We recorded all of the interviews. So we've got lots of recordings. If anybody wants to do qualitative data with us, come visit. Do those who report at baseline that they have had a life-changing spiritual religious experience use less alcohol? Well, on some measures, yes. For percent days abstinent and percent heavy drinking days, those who've had such experiences, this is at baseline. This is both baseline drinking and baseline spiritual transformation experiences, as you might call them. There's definitely a significant difference with the people who've had such experiences having more days abstinent and fewer heavy drinking days. The differences for drinks per drinking day and days since last drink are not significant. So what if we ask this question at 6 months? Have you had a life-changing spiritual religious experience since we talked to you last? And those who said yes, which wasn't that many, out of only 56 out of 209, had such an experience in that 6-month period. But those who had, percent days abstinent reflected it. And with the other drinking variables, you can see there's definitely a trend for heavier drinking amongst those who have not had such experiences. So these experiences seem to be potentially useful, but of course we can't induce it, right? We're not going to put people in sweat lodges, right? Or do other things that might in an attempt to induce such experiences. But I think that we can, as clinicians, kind of support people in interpreting and understanding these kind of experiences when they happen to them. This is the kind of things that people were talking about when they said that they'd had a life-changing spiritual religious experience. There was a big clump of what I'm calling danger. I shoulda, coulda, died. And it was everything from war to the house burning down to an accident, particularly driving under the influence, people going, geez, I mean, how did I not get killed, that kind of thing. So there was a big clump of those. And then there was another big clump around deliberate efforts to connect with God, Spirit, the transcendent, meditation, prayer, religious services, that sort of thing. And then there was another clump of other experiences which were much harder to put into nifty lumps. They ranged from the mundane to going to AA, talking with someone, being in nature, creative work, drawing, painting, that kind of stuff. And the experiences were generally positive. People felt at peace, consoled, felt a presence, a lot of people saw their grandmother and received a message from their grandmother about straightening up, flying right. People felt connected, accepting. But some experiences, as you mentioned, were negative. Not that many that were picked up on this particular question, but people felt scared, judged, alienated, questioning God, were angry at God. So there was a clump of those here that we noticed, and that also drove the next set of analysis around loss of faith. We found this remarkable gender difference in baseline reports of loss of faith. Over 50% of the women had a loss of faith at some point in their lives, whereas only about 38% of the men have had such experiences. We were very intrigued by this, particularly Amanda Price, my research assistant at the time, who really burrowed into this and found that for men, there's no significant correlation between when this loss of faith occurred and onset of alcoholism. But for women, the correlation is 0.54, which is extremely high for a social science correlation. We usually see correlations we're happy when we see correlations that are 0.2. So this is very striking.
Suppose you looked at trauma experience as well. Did you domestic violence, rape, those?
We only sort of in passing, and people didn't always want to tell us too much, so there was a limit to how much we pulled out of them. I think a more in-depth, I'd love to go back and do a more in-depth qualitative piece, because I don't know if these women, well, I'll show you what they said these experiences were like. We do have data on that. So when we looked at this data more closely, what we found out was that this loss of faith for the women occurred just before the onset of alcoholism, whereas for the men, the loss of faith occurred after. So there's something about that event. I'm not saying that the loss of faith caused the alcoholism, but whatever triggered the loss of faith is probably triggered the onset of alcoholism amongst these women. And as Nancy said, what kind of experiences were there? So we did a content analysis on what people said these experiences were like, and came up with 6 broad clumps. The percentages are the percentages for men and women. We find that about a little more than 3/4 of them describe this sort of gradual loss of interest in faith religion that you often see in young adults. The second clump, about 12%, if you look at everybody, is this much more active alienation, rejection from a religious congregation, doctrine, priest, or God. Death was a biggie. It caused a lot of loss of faith experiences for about 1/4 of the group. Other negative events, divorce, abuse, affairs, natural disasters, war, accidents, and mental illness also triggered another almost 1/4 of these loss of faith experiences. To my surprise, using drugs and alcohol, only 10%. And then we get these other vague responses where it's kind of hard to classify. The ones that were most common amongst women was the second one, around alienation, rejection. Some sense of you're not good enough for our congregation, or what you're doing, or what your mother's doing, or what happened to you, etc., is not kosher with with the way we look at things in this religious tradition. And there was a much higher incidence amongst the women of the other negative events. And we don't know where our women, the guys of course have much more exposure to war, but the women probably have higher incidence of exposure to abuse, affairs, possibly to mental illness. And so we really need to start separating them out. But the problem is that our sample size is shrinking. Then we're really only talking about 50 women here who have had a loss of faith. So it kind of gets a little tricky to tease this out. But there's a dissertation for somebody. Go and find out, why do women alcoholics have loss of faith? So then we looked at, well, does this predict drinking later, this interaction of gender, baseline loss of faith, and is this having an impact? And we found that at 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months, gender was a predictor of relapsing to heavy drinking. Loss of faith was never a predictor by itself, but remember, 2/3 of the sample are men, right? So it's kind of weighted in that way. But when you throw in this interaction of, how does the fact that this is a person who is both a woman and has loss of faith, then you can see, starting at 6 months, but definitely at 9 months and 12 months, this is a big issue. So let's look at this graphically. This is just such a cool chart. Amanda gets major points for this. This is average days since last drink, and time across the bottom. The green are the men who have had a loss of faith. The blue, the men who did not have a loss of faith. The pink are the women who had a loss of faith. And I don't know what color that is, sort of gray, blue. Those are the women who did not have a loss of faith. And you can see generally the women are a little slower to get sober than the men. But the women who have had a loss of faith are really struggling. Amanda's done this out, and by 2 years, the women start to catch up with the men. But it seems to take 2 years for this loss, whatever this experience was that triggered this. And what we haven't looked at is, well, if you had a loss of faith, did you then have a gain in faith? Did you then have a life-changing spiritual religious experience that then helped you regain your faith? That we haven't looked at yet. And the other thing I want to be sure and emphasize is that when people say that they've had a loss of faith, it doesn't usually mean that they don't believe in God anymore, or they never pray anymore. It's usually a rejection of a particular piece, maybe of a particular religious tradition. So we need to start disentangling, well, so how extreme was this loss of faith? Is it just sort of disillusionment from religion generally, or just what is the nature of that loss of faith? So we did paired sample t-tests to determine whether or not the change was significant, and then calculated eta squared, which is a nice way of figuring out whether or not this is a big deal that you found something significant. And we used multiple regressions and logistic regressions in order to look at the relationship to drinking. And we used the Tonigan et al. Scale to control for AA involvement. So, are there 12-month changes in spirituality, religiousness? Yes. You can see the loving, controlling God scale just doesn't do anything. The belief scale doesn't change. It's beginning to approach significance, where people believing just a little bit more. That's the direction that you're going in there. But what changes is the extent to which people's behaviors, the extent to people pray, meditate, read the Bible, etc. Day-to-day spiritual experiences increases. The 3-item forgiveness measure from the Fetzer, the Mager forgiveness of self, and the Mager forgiveness of others. And the negative religious coping improves also. And purpose in life goes up. It's all very interesting. So it's things like I feel abandoned by God. I feel God is punishing me for my lack of faith. Things like that. So I mean, they're really sort of negative attributions about God or one's relationship with God. Feeling rejected, and like God doesn't approve of me. And I expected that to be a much bigger deal with this sample, and I think for some of them it is, but it isn't an issue for everybody. So we looked at, this is a multiple regression, predicting 15-month % days abstinent and days since last drink. Unfortunately, purpose in life just washes out. It was important. If you do the same analysis from baseline to 6 months, it's important. It relates to drinking outcomes. But when you look at it after 1 year, it's not. So it may be one of those things that's more important early on that people start reevaluating the meaning of their lives and, God, this isn't what I want my life to be about. Those kinds of things might be more potent, more powerful in the first 6 months of sobriety. But we do see that private religious practices and daily spiritual experiences and forgiving oneself relates to days since last drink. Doesn't relate to percent days abstinent. And then when you look at heavy drinking days and days since last drinks per drinking day, which we had to dichotomize, we had to split it into two because of the way the distribution of the sample was. So it's either no heavy drinking at all or one or more heavy drinking days, and the same for drinks per drinking day. We found relationships for daily spiritual experiences and for magra forgiveness of self, which is real intriguing. Someone asked me the other day, well, why should that be important for alcoholics to forgive themselves? And I don't know if he was a new psychiatry resident and hadn't worked with substance abusers very much. But the whole idea of the hole that you find yourself in at the point at which you decide to turn your life around requires a lot of internal work around accepting how you got there and also what you need to do to get out of it. Then the last, we're going to get through in time. Okay, any questions about that before we continue onward? There's obviously a lot more we can and will do with this, but this is, like I said, the data is fairly new, and we're just now started to wade into it and analyze it. One of the things we did was we looked at whether or not people thought that AA was helpful. At 18 months, we asked people, what do you think helps people deal with alcohol problems? And we analyzed those open-ended responses into people who thought AA was helpful, people who gave mixed responses, people who thought AA was not helpful. And so we can tell you which people thought it was helpful and which people thought it was not helpful. And then we can look at whether or not those perceptions of AA's helpfulness or unhelpfulness relate to drinking outcomes. You would think it would, wouldn't you? But it's always good to have these things confirmed. And then what elements of AA are perceived to be helpful or not helpful? So, as I said, this was this interesting little question. What do you think helps people deal with alcohol problems? And then we looked at whether or not they said anything about it being useful to me. It couldn't just be, oh, well, some people think AA is helpful. We didn't count that. It was more like, well, I thought AA was really helpful, but, and then it would be counted as a mixed response because of the but. But, I thought AA was helpful would be, a helpful thing. So we categorize people into helpful, mixed, not helpful, or they didn't say anything about AA, and there was a clump of those. And then we analyzed, we did content analysis. So of the 286 respondents who we caught at 18 months, 42% thought that AA was helpful. 18% gave these more mixed comments. So if you combine 18 and 42, that's 60%. That's not bad, right? 19% had found AA unhelpful, and then 20% just didn't even mention AA in their responses at all. So then, does it make any difference what gender you are, how old you are, your education? None of these panned out except for age. People who were older tended to see AA as helpful, whereas those who were youngest in the group didn't mention AA at all. This is kind of interesting and kind of makes you wonder if the older you are, the more seriously you take this problem, because you don't have you can't keep messing up your life forever. But all these other demographic variables don't distinguish on this particular characteristic. But yeah.
Is there anything with like younger or older having more dependent criteria
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but it kind of gets answered in this next slide. You can see that probably that's true. The clinical characteristics, we get a whole slew of things that are different amongst those who see AA as helpful versus those who don't see it as helpful. Prior alcohol treatment, family history, the famous SIP score. People who found AA helpful had to deal with a lot more consequences of their alcohol problems. And they were also more severe. They had more DSM symptoms that they met. They also wanted to be abstinent, and they had attended AA before. Whereas those who didn't even mention AA, its chances are they'd never been in alcohol treatment. They're somewhat less likely to have a family history, pretty low SIP scores. Probably a lot of the moderation management program people are in here, but probably also some community sample people. Want to be abstinent, they don't want to be abstinent. You know, why do I want to go to AA when, you know, that they just want me to quit drinking? And only 30% of those who never mentioned it had even been to AA before. So then we charted, I'm not going to show you all the drinking outcomes, but just this one. Percent heavy drinking days in the last 90 days by AA's helpfulness. And as you can see, the people who said at 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, 18 months, who said that AA was not helpful are definitely doing worse in terms of percent heavy drinking days. Their percent heavy drinking days are bouncing around 20% of the days they're drinking heavily. See, everybody starts out pretty high in the very first set of columns on the left. But as you go across time, you can see that the folks in the maroon and the yellow bars, that they start to go up. They're either not, they don't like AA, or they're not even mentioning AA as one option in their strategies for managing their alcohol problem. So what did they say was helpful about AA? The fellowship was the most common thing that people mentioned. Sharing, talking, listening, phrases like this, having someone to talk to, being around others who've been there, sober people to be with, sober activities, things like that. Another big clump was around the program, the AA program, steps, meeting sponsors, admitting that one had the problem, which is, of course, step one, and working the big book. And then there was a cluster of other more miscellaneous comments. Not that much stuff where people spontaneously mentioned spirituality. People giving advice, guidance, they appreciated AA for that. And then there was a fair number of people who just gave something vague like, well, it helps you not to drink. I'm not quite sure how, but it helps them not drink. But what's not helpful? I don't know how much you guys in the back can see this, so I'll try to read these. But I wanted to share it. Can't relate to others in AA groups or meetings. Looks too much at the negative. There's too much complaining. I thought I could handle it on my own. And then there's a waste of time. Some people just disliked the model, the structure, the language of AA. Some people thought it was too religious. 9 people didn't like the court-ordered people who were there. And 9 people also said, I'm not that bad. I'm not like those people. So you can almost hear in the transcript, that emphasis. People talk too much about drinking. It's too depressing. I don't like groups in general. I don't believe in God, a higher power. People are hypocritical and phony. And then 7 people came right out and said, I needed more than that. I needed more than AA. I needed treatment, I needed residential treatment, or some sort of a program of that sort. And then there were a bunch of other miscellaneous comments. Oh, it makes people want to drink. I don't want to admit that I'm out of control. People with non-alcohol issues are a problem. So basically, I don't want to talk about drinking, but don't talk about other things. So we had Stories are repetitive. There's only a few people who said it was too male, which I thought was interesting, because sometimes that charge has been made. Too cult-like. It's dogmatic. I never wanted to stop drinking, just frank admission. And there's somebody who was court-ordered who didn't really want to go and was only going because they were ordered. And another person, it looks too much at the past. So this is the kind of thing that people are saying is not helpful about AA. And I was commenting earlier that it's almost like it's the flip side of what's good about AA. What's good about AA is the fellowship and the program. The only way you could address these critiques is... Hello? The only way you could address these critiques is by changing AA into something it's not, right? So, I mean, to a great extent, this is... it's. I don't think you can ask AA to change how they run things to address these problems. But it's quite possible that there are people with social anxiety disorders who have alcohol dependence, and maybe we need to think about more supporting the development and spreading the word about online groups, online 12-step groups, which are out there and which can be found, and a lot of people swear by them. And we need more research on court-ordered programs and whether or not that really works. Yes?
I'm just curious about your methods in organizing this. So you were doing content analysis line by line, or did you use some sort of program to help you organize all of that stuff?
We did it line by line, right? Phrase by phrase, practically. You know, I mean, the phrase had to hang together. You know, we didn't code waste and time separately, but waste of time. You know.
Did you have more than one person looking at the same transcript to sort of...
Yep, there were 3 of us doing it. Yeah. And we looked at these and we looked at these and we looked at them over and over and over again. Yeah. And we'd like to do, this is just at 18 months, and we'd really like to do it again at the final interview. But we'll have to find a grant for that. Or either that or somebody who wants to do it for a dissertation. Or a postdoc. So we see that spiritual and religiously related events, like having life-changing spiritual religious experiences or loss of faith, appear to play a significant role in reductions in drinking. And that loss of faith seems to be particularly toxic for women alcoholics. It's either toxic in and of itself, or it's a flag about something that's been very destructive to this particular person. We're finding that many spiritual religious dimensions change over time amongst alcoholics, irregardless of treatment status, AA involvement, and desire to be abstinent. We still pick up on these changes, which is when you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot when you say, oh, well, let's just throw everybody in here and see if there's a difference. Irregardless of whether or not they want to get sober, irregardless of whether they are in treatment or not, or in AA or not. And we're still finding that people are shifting, people are changing, which I think is really kind of exciting. Who would have thought? And we're finding that changes are occurring in 7 of 12 measures of spirituality and religiousness. What people practice, what they do, their day-to-day experiences, forgiveness, very big issue in AA, negative religious coping, which is really about developing a different relationship with God or with your higher power, let's be more precise, and sense of meaning and purpose in life. So the most consistent predictors of 15-month drinking were daily spiritual experiences and forgiveness of oneself. When we did this at 6 months, we found that purpose in life was the most important outcome variable predicting, was the most important spiritual religious variable predicting drinking outcomes, which is why I said that I think that at different points in time, different spiritual religious dimensions are important. Perceptions of AA's helpfulness is associated with decreased drinking. So this is always the most fun part of any talk. So we find that forgiveness of self is a significant predictor of outcome across sites and drinking outcomes, which is, for those of you in the field, it's like, but it's always nice, right, to have these things confirmed. Increases in a sense of purpose and meaning in life were not associated with decreased drinking at 15 months, although they were at 6 months. So, again, do these dimensions change differently over time? Private religious practices and daily spiritual experiences at 6 months were not associated with changes in drinking, but there they are, showing up at 12 months. The other thing I want to emphasize, and one of the reasons I showed you all the site differences, is because it's very easy for us to think that all alcoholics are like the alcoholics that I see, when that's not true at all. There's such an incredible range of what the population of folks with alcohol, let alone, let's throw in people who have drug addiction problems. We haven't even talked about that. But so we really need to remember that what we come up with may be, may or may not be generalizable to other populations. It's not that it's not worth looking at, but just be aware that we have to be cautious in extrapolating from any single sample. AA involvement is associated with spiritual religious change and with better outcomes, but we really don't know very much yet about the nature, the type of AA involvement that leads to spiritual religious change. And it probably is going to be different for different people, right? For some people, having a sponsor right away may be really critical. For other people, they may need to kind of dance around the sponsor issue for a while before they kind of settle into that part of being in AA. So we have grand plans for some really fancy hierarchical linear models and trajectory analysis and other sorts of things to look at whether or not these results hold when we look at other predictors, whether or not what are the trends over time in each of these things, not just drinking, but each of these dimensions, as well as spirituality, as well as AA involvement. I want to acknowledge NIAAA, but also most right up there are respondents. We really came to appreciate them all, even the difficult ones. And these are some of the 25 or 30 research assistants who worked with us on the project. Amy Krentzman is my postdoc. Stephen Schermack and Mary Klosser are at the VA. Kirk Brower and Bob Zucker are at the U of M Addiction Research Center. So, can I take any questions?